I'm Laura London, and this is the transformation of Speaking of Jung. Returning to us today for episode 135 is Professor Paul Bishop at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He studied at the College of St. Mary Magdalen at the University of Oxford, where he was a doctoral candidate in the Faculty of Modern Languages, and spent a year as the Lady Julia Henry Fellow at Harvard. He graduated with a Ph.D. from Oxford in 1994 with the dissertation C.G. Jung's Reception of Friedrich Nietzsche, which was later published as the book The Dionysian Self. After holding the position of Professor of German at the University of Glasgow, in 2013, he was named the William Jacks Chair in Modern Languages at the university's School of Modern Languages and Cultures, where he currently serves as an Honorary Professorial Research Fellow. In 2010, Professor Bishop presented Reading Goethe at Midlife, Ancient Wisdom, German Classicism, and Jung for the Zurich Lecture Series at the International School of Analytical Psychology, known as ISAP, in Zurich. And in 2022, he presented his essay, The Red Book and Other Searchers for the Soul, The Case of Claugus and Jung, at the Eranos Conference, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul in the 21st Century, which was later published as Volume 5 in the book series by Chiron. Professor Bishop has worked widely on different aspects of analytical psychology and its place in intellectual history. His research is focused on the intellectual background of both psychoanalysis and Jungian psychology. He is the editor of several titles, including Jung in Contexts, The Persistence of Myth as Symbolic Form, and a companion to Goethe's Faust. He is also the author of over a dozen books, including Jung's Answer to Job, Nietzsche's The Antichrist, which we're going to have to talk about that sometime, and Reading Plato Through Jung, which was the subject of our first interview in episode 131. Last year, his essay, I Don't Permit the Winter, Death and Life in Goethe and Jung, was published in the new book, Confronting Death, edited by Jungian psychoanalyst Louise Morris, who was our guest in episode 90, and Murray Stein, who has been our guest in 14 episodes. And the first volume in Professor Bishop's new series, Jung and the Epic of Transformation, was published in May by Chiron. Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival and the Grail as Transformation is the subject of our talk today. Please consider helping Speaking of Jung stay on the air by contributing to our tip jar on Patreon for just $5 a month, or by making a one-time or recurring donation through PayPal. You can find the links in the description box below, or by visiting the support page on our website, speakingofjung.com. You can also help our YouTube channel grow by clicking the thumbs up on our video, or thumbs down, that's for you to decide. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. It's free and it helps us grow. I am also here to remind you of the importance of recording your dreams. Temenos Dream is a revolutionary dream tracking app available for iOS and Android. Now you can record your dreams by speaking into your phone or typing them into the app. Search for myths, legends, and fairy tales related to the themes in your dreams. Use the new advanced AI interpretation with a focus on Jung's work, looking closely at symbols and associations to consider shadow, anima, animus, archetypes, and much more. You can help support Speaking of Jung simply by downloading the app and creating a free account. Unlimited use is available with a premium subscription. Click on the link in the description box below or on our website, speakingofjung.com, where you will find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This video interview, which Professor Bishop and I are dedicating to the memory of Anne Casement, is being recorded on Wednesday, January 29th, 2025, through the magic of StreamYard. Hi, Professor Bishop.
Hello, Laura. Hi there. Call me Paul. Do that. It'll
can't.
make me feel much, much easier.
Not today. Not today. Okay, I have to edit this part out. I forgot to move my screen. Okay, here we go. Okay. Let me do that again. Do you mind if I call you Professor Bishop? I have to. It establishes your authority.
You could do that, but then I have to say we don't need to, and then we're even.
Okay, but I'm going to do it anyway.
You do it anyway. It's your show.
My show. It's our show. It's our show. Okay, so I'm going to say that again. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. It's great to see you again, Professor Bishop. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Well, Laura, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. Good to see you again. And how is the Phoenix flying these days?
The Phoenix is a flight, I will say. The Phoenix is a flight. Thank you for asking. Yes. So we are here today because you and I did an episode together a year ago. It was a year ago, January. It was episode 131. Yeah. And we ended that episode with me inviting you back to talk about your, at that time, upcoming series, 4-volume series with Chiron Publications on Jung and the Epic of Transformation. And I had no idea what it was about. The first volume was released in May, and you did an episode actually of our friend of the show, Miguel Connor's Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, which there will be a link to that in the show notes. And I was on hiatus when that book came out. And when I decided to bring Speaking of Jung back, you were one of the first people I contacted because I had planned on doing a series of episodes with you about the books because of my interest in the topic. So we're a little late, but here we are, and the timing has been impeccable as always because of the synchronicities that I've been sharing with you over the past month that I've experienced with this book. So I need to step out of the way now and have you say hi to everybody and tell us a little bit about what you've been up to.
Well, thank you very much for that, Laura. Yes, it really has been a year. It's gone fast. So I guess we must have been having fun if the time's gone that quickly. And one of the things I've been trying to do to fit it, as it were, has been working on this series, which is a fantastic opportunity for me, and I'm really glad that Chiron is on board with it. And that is to do a series of 4 books on the great texts of German literature. There were also the great texts of German literature as far as Jung was concerned. And so what I wanted to do was to pick, as it were, the big 4. People say the canon is over, but I don't believe that's the case. I think canonicity is still a valid idea. If it's good enough for Harold Bloom, it's good enough for me. And I wanted to start with.
What do you mean by that? The canon is over.
Well, I think there's a sense, and maybe there's a difference here between how canonicity is looked at in the States and maybe overseas. I mean, I know there's a tradition in American universities of doing the great texts, and you'd find very few universities in the UK that would offer something as straightforward as that. I think nowadays we're much more interested in the margins. We're much more interested in the oppressed. And there's been a sense that the canon was something artificially constructed in order to exclude certain voices, and that's the case that people make against the canon. There's another way to look at that, which is to say that, look, whether one likes it or not, certain texts have been profoundly influential, for good or for bad, depending on your point of view, and that canonicity enables one to explore those margins. Because, well, if you don't have a center, how do you know where the margins are? Mm. So it's a kind of defense of the canon. It's working with the idea of the canon, and because it's Jung, I really had to start in the Middle Ages because, as Jung says, that's the period that we've still got to work through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tell us what you think he meant by that. Why?
Well, what a good question. So often I think all one has to do is to pick up a book by Jung, look at it, find a sentence and think, what does he mean by that? I mean, thinking about this phrase where he talks about the Middle Ages, he says, I must catch up with a piece of the Middle Ages within myself. So it's there's the sense of a task. There is a sense of an act of recuperation, something that is within him, that constitutes him, that's part of him. And he says, we've only finished the Middle Ages of others.
Yes.
So if you like, there's your marginality, okay?
Mm.
But what we have to look at is, what does the Middle Ages mean for us? And I think that's why he's so interested in this period, and in particular this fascinating strand within medieval literature and culture, which is Arthurian legend, and in particular the Grail.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so tell us a little bit about this 4-part series and why it's a 4-part series and what you're going to cover. And you do explain that in this book. This is the first volume. As I mentioned, it was released in May. And volume 1 is entitled Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival and the Grail as Transformation. So let's tell the listeners the 4 books that you cover.
Parzival is where we're starting, for reasons that we can talk about. I mean, You've got to start somewhere, you know.
Right.
You've got to start somewhere. At volume 2, which I'm working on at the moment, and is very close to completion, and I hope publication in the course of this year, is going to be on Goethe's Faust. Mm-hmm. So you can't get much more canonical and can't get much more great text than that. It was a super important text as far as Jung was concerned. I mean, his writing is saturated with references to Faust. So that's going to be volume 2. Hot on its heels, I think the next year after that is going to be Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. Again, Nietzsche, such a linchpin figure, I think one could call him for Jung. Zarathustra, the subject of that great seminar that Jung gave between 1934 and 1939. So plenty to say about that. And then in volume 4 itself, I want to end where the sequence, I think, does reach a kind of certain culmination, and that's with the Red Book. And what I want to do in that is to read the Red Book as an epic, and to treat all of these texts as what they are, which is epic texts in all senses of that word, but especially in the context of medieval literature. The idea of an epic is very close, I think, to the kind of pagan, to the pre-Christian traditions that precede it. Homer is the obvious example there to cite. And the reason why I wanted to start with Wolfram von Eschenbach is because his Parzival is, I think, arguably the richest, the most significant, the most powerful, and the most moving iteration of the Grail legend. Other people write about the Grail, but Wolfram does it in a way which is, I think one can justifiably say, truly canonical.
Mm-hmm. So these 3 texts, Parzival, Faust, and Zarathustra, you say had a big influence on Jung. So let's start with Parzival, which this volume is about, and how specifically you found it influenced Jung.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the essence of the thesis lies in what Jung himself says in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And I know we have got, we haven't quite discovered the full truth of how Memories, Dreams, Reflections works as a text, but those protocols are on the way. So we'll soon know. And in that, Jung talks about how important it was for him as a child, when he was learning to read, that he came across the Arthurian legend. And he talks about that as being something which was profoundly important for him. And indeed, I mean, he's not unusual in that these great medieval epics are, very much the foundation stone of Western literature. But he also, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, gives us 2 remarkable dreams in a book which is full of remarkable dreams, you'll quite rightly say, but which are specifically focused on the Grail. And there's the one where he's at midday and he sees this figure going down the streets, and it's tied up with his battle with Freud, and the other figure is a customs officer. So we have these kind of dual figures: the customs officer, which Jung associates, I think, with Freud, and the Grail Knight, which is what he associates with himself. And he immediately goes into talking about how important the Grail legend was, because it has, he says, the idea of meaning. It has the idea of meaning, of meaningfulness. It's not just grubbing around in other people's luggage, which is what the customs man does, he says, but rather it's concerned with something far more profound. And I think that this idea is taken up in a later dream that he has. It's during the time when he's on his trip to India, where he has this very, very impressive dream about the Grail castle and about his own relation to it. And that, I think, is a very important signal for why Parzival, why the Grail legend, why the image, the symbol of the Grail is so important for him. Mm-hmm. It's certainly true that the direct citations are much fewer than is in the case of Goethe and Nietzsche. But the key idea of what the Grail is about, which is transformation, is, I would argue, central to how Jung sees his project. And so if we understand the Grail legend, we also get a little bit closer to understand what it is that Jung himself means by individuation. So individuation, as it were, I would say, is a quest for transformation.
Individuation is a quest for transformation. Yes. Yeah. And I didn't get that until I read this book. I had so many aha moments, realizations, synchronicities, truly. And I was sharing them with you all month long around this book. And see, now I did what I promised myself I wouldn't do. Is you and I were chatting before we started recording, and now I can't remember if I said it to you when we were chatting before recording or if I said it while we were recording. So here I go again. Say it again.
Yeah.
I was, and I think I'm going to do a video explaining to the listeners about, because I think it's important, about what I went through, why I put the podcast on hiatus, what I did during the hiatus, and why I decided to come back. Did I say this during the recording that you were one of the reasons why I didn't?
Yeah.
So one of the reasons why I brought the podcast back from hiatus, because I didn't know. I was about 50-50 on whether or not the project I was working on was going to be extended or was going to turn into something bigger. And not only didn't it get extended or turn into something bigger, it ended early. So before it ended, there's a video on this channel that I did at the end of October where I talk about, speaking of Jung is still alive. So long story short, I don't want this to be about me, but I like to use it as an example. Maybe it's an example of the transformation. I don't think I'm explaining this well, but it stuck with me that I wanted to do more episodes with you and I didn't get to. So you were one of the first people that I contacted when I knew Speaking of Jung was coming back, and I didn't know what was going to be in this book. I hadn't read I thought it was Parzival. I didn't know the German one. This is from the 12th century?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The entire text you told me is available online. There will be a link to it in the show notes. It's fair use now, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I didn't know what it was about. I didn't know the origins of this. I didn't know its influence on Jung. And so I started reading the book, and sometimes I don't read the whole book that I'm going to be talking about. I just skim through it. This book I read start to finish and then started rereading. The third section is specifically about Jung and analytical psychology and the Grail as transformation. I'd like to read two passages from the book that really struck me and affected me. You write, this is pages 170 and 171. The message of Parzival is thus not about fleeing this world, but about positioning ourselves correctly in it, trusting to our senses without allowing ourselves to be deceived by them. And this same message can be found in Faust, Zarathustra, and the Red Book, namely, that the coordination of our various faculties, including the intellect and the senses, especially sight and touch, or the hand and the eyes, or the rational and the irrational, or ultimately consciousness and the unconscious, is the precondition for salvation. Indeed, in a sense, it is salvation itself. That really struck me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you would say a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. No. I think it's a good example of the way the Parzival story, and it is available in the translation by Jesse L. Weston, which is very old, bit out of date, unphilological, immensely atmospheric, immensely stylistically powerful, can help us understand these key ideas of Jung, because I think Jung's coming out of this tradition. And it's not a point about him being, lacking in originality. It's a point about him tapping into the same sources as the predecessors. And I think that even something like Parzival, which might not immediately occur to people as being a psychoanalytic text, is deeply psychoanalytic, and deeply Jungian, avant la lettre, in the way that it talks about the unconscious, in the way that it talks about desire, in the way that the central figure himself is on a journey, is on a quest. He's on what in medieval terms is called an avventura, an adventure. And this is an epic of self-discovery, because where we see Parzival at the beginning, he doesn't know what he is. He has to, as Nietzsche says, become what you are. He has to become what he is. And this passage, I think, here that you've highlighted, gives us one of those as a kind of snapshot moment in this process of his becoming, his coming to himself, and him finding out really what the Grail means for him. Because it relates to a conversation that he has with Gurnemans. And Gurnemans is one of the figures in Parzival who has a kind of educational function. And Parzival, I guess, like all of us, is interested in getting advice from people. And he gets them in particular from his mother, Herzeloid, from Gurnemans, who turns out to be his uncle, and from Trevritzent, the hermit. And one of the things that he's told from Gurnemans is to make use of his senses. And I quote this line here: "Thou canst hear and see, I wot well full 5 shalt thou senses be, and thou use them aright, then wisdom, it draweth anear to thee." And I think this point about the senses is so important for understanding what this tradition out of which Jung eventually emerges does, how important it sees the body. And we find Jung talking about the importance of the body in all kinds of places. His seminar on Nietzsche's Zarathustra makes that one of the major things that Nietzsche discovers. And I think, taking this back to Parzival, why are the senses important? Well, because they have a kind of wisdom. Understanding what's going on around us, using our senses, is part of orientating ourselves in a world. And Parzival is in a world which is a very confusing world. He turns up and sees the Grail ceremony. What the heck is that about? Okay, he has to use his senses, both all of the 5 ones, physiological ones, but also he's meant to use his human intelligence and his empathy. And the first time that he sees the Grail ceremony, he fails to do that. Partly because he's misunderstood what he's given this advice about not asking too many questions by Gurnemans. Well, of course, he, I think, gets that wrong, because it's don't ask too many questions. But if they're these people processing around with this massive thing called a Grail, and you're in the castle of a Fisher King, and there's a whole liturgical ceremony going on around it, you ought to ask a question. So his failure, although, for lots of reasons, we might also be, it's a very British kind of mistake, is to kind of, I'm not going to say anything about it, but I'll just see how it's going to come out here. But this is part, I think, of what I'm trying to argue, that this journey into discovering where one sits in the world it's there in Parzival, is what his quest is about. It's also there in Faust, who is this frustrated academic who lacks any kind of effective, intuitive, and sensory contact to the world. It's there to Zarathustra, who is on this mission to declare the body as holy and sacred. And all of these themes, I hope you'd agree, Laura, one also finds them in the Red Book as well. So as we read these predecessors, we bring them to the Red Book, and also the Red Book allows us to look back and see this tradition more clearly and appreciate it in a new way as well.
So as you mentioned, volume 4 in this series will be on the Red Book, but what I love about this first volume is that you do mention the other the material that will be in the other 3 volumes, and also you do bring up the Red Book quite a bit. And as I'm sure a lot of the listeners have struggled with understanding the Red Book and go back to it, and my gosh, it's been out now for how many years? It was released in 2009. I remember when we all got our copies, and it's been out for quite some time, and I still struggle with understanding it. But I have to say that the parts of it that you quote in this book and that you bring in to use as examples have just really reinvigorated my interest in the Red Book and have brought in an understanding at a level that I never had before. So I'm really looking forward to that volume, but I've gotten so much out of this volume as far as the Red Book, because as much as, and I don't know, maybe some of the listeners aren't very interested in Parzival or Faust or Zarathustra, they all tie in, and you bring them in for a reason because of their influence on Jung. And I love what you said about how it wasn't that Jung wasn't original, but he was tapping into the same source.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. I've never heard anybody put it that way before. So another section that I would like to read, actually, what I had here for the next one, you just really covered. You write on page 186, sometimes it is a mistake to ask a question. Sometimes it is a mistake not to ask. What makes the hero a hero is knowing when to ask and when not.
Yeah. But it's true, though, isn't it?
Yeah, very.
That's one of the things that I'm glad that that the book is having this effect on you of trying to tie the Red Book into this tradition from which it emerges. And I suppose I've got a little bit of a mission to try and say to people who are interested in Jung, which is look at Zarathustra, look at Faust, look at Parzival, because these are great texts in the German tradition. And very often I think people are kind of put off by the aura of canonicity. I mean, canonicity can be used as a way of saying, this is extraordinarily complex, far too difficult for you, so you don't need to look at it or concern yourself with it. And I guess that there is that temptation, even or especially with the Red Book, because again, I mean, it's going to take us more than a quarter of a century. It's going to take us several centuries to understand, I think, what's going on in that work there. And I think that one finds in these works, something which is a practical take-home point, as it were. I mean, there is something of therapeutic, of existential significance that we can learn from these texts, because after all, Parzival is trying to find his way in the world, and we're all trying to find our way in the world. We're all embarked on an adventure of one kind or another. We're all looking for something, and in that sense, we're all questing for something. And so it seems to me that it's only natural that when one looks at a text like Parzival, which explicitly engages with that as a theme, and which makes that the core of what Wolfram's epic is about, that we should, if we're interested in Jung, find there's a resonance here and a kind of mutual understanding between this German literary tradition, this epic tradition on the one hand, and Jungian psychology on the other. So it's about a dialogue between these two traditions, which I hope enriches and perfects our understanding of both.
And on another area that I highlighted, just the way that you word this has been so helpful to me. You say, the quest for the Grail is the search for higher spiritual understanding, for the attainment, in other words, of the self. So you are equating this, as you said earlier, to Jung's concept of individuation. And what else in this story of Parzival led you to that insight?
Yeah. Well, I think the central image of the Grail itself, as I've tried to express in that passage that you were quoting there, gets us to think about what Jung means by the self. I mean, what is the Grail is a very, very difficult question to answer, because it's not only Wolfram who has this, who makes use of it. He's borrowing on a French predecessor, Chrétien de Troyes, who writes Parzival, or The Search for the Grail, and Chrétien never finishes his version because he dies before he finishes it. And so there's a bit of a cliffhanger there, and various writers after Chrétien tried to take it up, tried to extend it, and there are several sort of versions which offer a more complete ending, or offer a more elaborate ending than one finds with Chrétien. But they too are going back to sources in Celtic legend. They're going back to Celtic folklore, to Christian legend. They're going back to the Isis book that we find in the Metamorphosis of Apuleius, the golden ass, as it's sometimes translated. There are Hermetic elements as well. So we've got this huge cultural melee which is coming together, and which then feeds into Arthurian tradition, Arthurian legend, which itself has all kinds of interesting cultural primordial sources. It brings together Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and it's a national myth which is curiously international in so many ways. And so the Grail for some is a cup, for others it's a chalice, for some it is a platter. In the case of what we find with Wolfram, it's a stone. But it has these properties of changing the individual who engages with it. And so it seems to me it's a bit like, that image that Jung appends to his red book, the Systema Mundi Totius, that thing where you have all of these concentric circles and so on. And in the middle of it, I think you could put a stone or a chalice. Actually, there is a chalice in the first version that he does, interestingly enough, that diagram. Or you could put a stone, but you could put something, it's going to be a symbol of the self. And how we journey to the self is treated in an epic form, I would say, by Wolfram, how it is that Parzival undertakes this journey toward discovering the Grail. And that's discovering something about himself, because he is the Grail king. He doesn't know that at the beginning. He doesn't know a lot of things at the beginning at all. He really is, in the German, medieval German word, is tump. He's daft. He's stupid. He doesn't know. He's certainly in this socially disadvantaged background, being brought up in the forest by his mother, Hatzeloid.
Yeah.
And he's got to learn to make his way in the world. He's got to learn to make his way in the Arthurian court. He upsets people in the Arthurian court. He doesn't know how to behave. He doesn't know how to be courtly and so on. And so somebody who comes from these most humble beginnings is then at the end elevated to this status which they were right from the start, which is the Grail king. And so his discovery about the Grail is a symbol for that discovery of what his true nature is, and him becoming it and living it and experiencing it, and doing so joyfully. Doing so joyfully,
and joy is another theme in this book that I want to get to. But first, I'd like to talk about suffering, because that was another. So the topics of joy and suffering were very timely for me, were very insightful, and they had a huge effect on me because those are two things that I had been grappling with very recently. And then I realized all throughout my analysis. And this book helped me understand them in a way that I had never understood them before, and the connections here. So I want to read on pages 227 and 228. This is very short. You write, returning to Jung's letter of 1926, which you had referenced prior, we find that Jung draws this conclusion, quote, try to apply seriously what I have told you, for that you might escape suffering. Nobody can escape it, but that you may avoid the worst, blind suffering. So conscious suffering, right? In analysis, when I would, and I've mentioned this on this podcast before, when I would be suffering and I'd go to my analytic hour, my session with my analyst, and she would tell me what a great thing that was that I was suffering, and I never understood that. And this book helped me understand that. So I would like for you to explain a little bit about what you write about the concept of suffering in this book.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, Laura. I think I'd go about thinking about it in this way, that we have in Parzival, as a work of literature, we have both his individual journey, which we were talking about a moment ago, and I'm saying it's, his quest for the Grail is his quest for the self, and so on. But we also have other figures around as well, and so they also contribute to making the text itself, making Wolfram's epic work itself a kind of transformational act, a journey of transformation upon which one embarks when one is a reader of it. And so it's important, therefore, that it's not simply Parzival himself who suffers, and he suffers in a particularly theological way, that he thinks that God hates him. He has this one of the great themes of the book, one of the great questions motivating it is to do with the nature of God, and Parzival thinks that he's being punished by God because he messes up around the Grail when he sees it the first time and fails to ask the question. He sees, God has robbed me of that opportunity. Again, very psychologically insightful, that rather than owning up to one's mistakes, one tries to blame somebody else. And stuff like that. I mean, it's full of psychological nuances like that. But one of the key figures, Amfortas, the Fisher King, is suffering. It is he who has, the Amfortas wound that we know from particularly Wagner's treatment of the theme in his opera Parzival. He has the Amfortas wound, described in various ways and in various iterations of the Grail as being, he's struck with a spear through his genitals. It's related to the idea of infertility. I think those are themes that one finds in the way that Wolfram takes it and treats it. But more than that is the emphasis that's put on the suffering that this wound creates.
Yeah.
And at the opening, I think, of book 13, we're given a picture of him on a particularly bad day when he's screaming out in agony. The smell of the wound, the stench is so great that they have to open the windows because it's so awful, this wound and its decaying thing. So it is, as a work that faces very much up to suffering in all its forms, in the very, very physical suffering that Amfortas is undergoing. But of course, because it's literary work, there's also a symbolic dimension to that as well.
Yeah.
And the fact that the cure for Amfortas is tied up with Parzival's discovering his own identity. So those two narrative tracks come together in a beautiful way in the conclusion of the epic. and I think say something important about the role of suffering as well. It's not downplayed. It's not treated in a light way. On the contrary, but it is something which is made sense of. And it seems to me that in that letter that we quoted from earlier, that Jung is talking about this point, the meaninglessness of suffering. That's the real problem.
The meaninglessness of suffering. That's the real problem. Yeah. So then let's talk about joy. And you and I were emailing back and forth about that because I learned about the German word for joy. And so where does joy come in here?
Yeah.
And I don't want to give away the ending, but
well, I mean, I think it's one of these. It's one of these works where even though you know the outcome, I mean, it's like Faust. I mean, we all know that at the end, Faust is going to be Faust is he's going to be the Goethe version, which is what's so astounding. But each time I think, how can that possibly be? Seeing all the damage that he's done beforehand and so on. So
yeah.
So the interest lies in how can this be possible? And I think that knowing that there is this positive outcome, and I think it's interesting that in these texts that we do have positive outcomes. That we have works which are more or less complete. Oddly, there are some scenes in Goethe's Faust which he never got round to reading, to writing. Nietzsche planned fifth and sixth parts of Zarathustra, which never appeared. But we do have coherent texts which have an ending. So that's a kind of a class. There is a classical rounding out of the subject matter rather than a romantic or modernist or postmodernist kind of fragment. And I think that what we find when we read Parzival as an epic is that we're taken on that adventure ourselves, and that it pulls us along with it, knowing that there is a conclusion doesn't detract in any way from working out, well, how is that actually going to be the case? And there is so much rich nuance and detail in Wolfram's book. I mean, it in some respects, it's absolutely medieval. And you've got all these knights running around and priests and hermits and things. So pretty medieval, I think we could agree.
Yeah.
But it's also, I think, astonishingly modern in its theological interest, his question, what is God? The way that it treats the idea of suffering, and in this existential program of transformation, which is enacted in these various stages of the epic as we go through it.
So Parzival's epic is a 3-part quest, right? For the hero's identity, for joy. Would you pronounce the German word Vroude?
Well, it's not just German; it's medieval German. So it's a big ask, but I think Freude is probably going to be good enough. It's palpably close to the modern German Freude, as in An die Freude, Ode to Joy, which we know from Schiller, which we know from Beethoven's setting, and its use as the anthem of the European Union as well, as it happens.
But it also sounds like Freud.
There we go. There we go.
I'm sorry, I don't think of joy when I think of Freud. So Parzival's epic, no, not many people do, depicts a 3-fold quest for the hero's identity, for joy, and for the mysterious Grail. And in the course of the quest, he's transformed from a fool. I'm just giving a little synopsis here for the listeners. He's transformed from a fool into the Lord of the Grail. And the power of the Grail brings about a collective transformation as well, a collective transformation. And the series examines the key texts in German literature and thought that were, in Jung's own estimation or by scholarly consent, highly influential on his thinking. And this project consists of 4 titles. They're sequentially arranged, and they are kind of important, not kind of, they are important in us interpreting and understanding Jung's Red Book and what his influences were. So would you say a little bit more, though, about this concept of joy? Because that is how your book ends. This volume, how it ends, which I
right.
love.
Well, that's good. I mean, we'd all like things to end in joy, wouldn't we? I mean, so it's nice when one comes across a text where that's actually the case. I mean, just to give an example of how important it is, at the beginning of book 15, Parzival remembers his love for his wife, for Confronting, whom he's left, of course, as he's gone off on his questing Aventura and so on. But he says he laments that God does not wish him happiness, this Freude. So that's part of his quarrel with God. The fact that he doesn't have Freude links up the fact that he hasn't got an understanding of God. So there's a very important theological dimension to this. And I think this comes right at the beginning when in the middle of the forest, in which he's being brought up, Parzival asks his mother, Owe, was ist Gott? So tell me, what is God? It's an extraordinary question for a young child to be asking. Apparently, St. Thomas Aquinas asked that as about a 6-year-old to his tutor as well. But I guess Aquinas is a fairly unusual individual as well. But he has this question, was ist Gott? And whether it's that medieval High German or modern German, was ist Gott, we can all understand that question.
Yeah.
And he's told by Herzl that God is about light and everything that is light and luminous and shining and so on. And so she keeps out the aspect of the dark. And so when Parzival sees the knights going through the forest, he thinks, that must be God, because their armor is reflecting the sunlight and shining in the sunlight as well. It all looks wonderfully luminous. And so he thinks that's God. I mean, it obviously isn't God. But the fact that he has to ask this question shows that we haven't got a naive, medieval, quote unquote, worldview of humankind on one side and God on the other. It's far more, I can't help saying, modern, existential in the way that it treats this theme. So Freud is important because it's being withheld, but it is also something which is then later on achieved, and it's specifically announced by this very strange female figure of Kundry, who turns up and is very, very negative about Arthur's court on the first time that she shows up. A good example of the fact that, even in medieval days, people thought that things were going to rot. But the second time that she appears, her message is much more positive. She hails Parzival as, she says, the crown of human salvation, she says. And she emphasizes, in particular, the bodily joy that he will experience in his status as a husband to conduire amour, but also a bodily joy because it is concretely situated in the world. And that includes the familial dimension, that includes the social dimension as well. And that's what makes this theme of Freude so significant. And I think that there's a shift that takes place when he's reunited with his wife, Confronting amour, which he can be united with her because he has discovered his identity, he knows his place in the world, and a shift takes place between what he has experienced, which is Sorge, so care, worry, anxiety, and that applies for her as well, because of course her hubby's been off doing all of these things, and this is replaced by Freude. So we have a dynamic that moves from Sorge, care, through to Freude and joy. And interestingly, Laura, we find in the final act of Faust, part 2, we have the figure that comes on, of course, of care, of Sorge. And so interesting that this dynamic, how do we get from care to joy, from anxiety to joy, is there in this medieval text. It's there in this classical romantic text. And I think we could say that it's also there in the Red Book as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask you next, because we're starting to come to the end of our time, and I do want to touch on another book that you contributed an essay to called Confronting Death. But before we wrap up on volume 1 here, would you like to share anything here with the listeners about your connection of Parzival with the Red Book? Is there anything that, because I could imagine listeners are going to be like, oh, she kept talking about the Red Book, but didn't give any examples specific, or did we?
Well, we talked about the Middle Ages. We gave a little reference there, didn't we?
Well, I mean, you quote the Red Book a lot in this book. And I thought maybe you could give us maybe your favorite example of
I'd be glad
of how Jung was influenced by Parzival, specifically give an example that you see in the Red Book.
Yeah. Okay, I'll give 2 examples there. One, the episode that we find in Liber Secundus,
Yes.
where Jung, this is part of that peculiar episode when he's in the psychiatric institution. He meets the librarian, he meets the cook, and then all of a sudden, it's one of these sort of strange sci-fi things. He pushes aside a curtain and he finds himself in Klingsor's garden. Klingsor is there in the medieval myth. Much more prominently, it has to be said, in Wagner. But Jung does use the old medieval German Parzival spelling rather than the Wagnerian one. There are lots of resonances and echoes, I think, through these different iterations of the Grail legend, some of which I think Jung will most definitely have been aware of. And then it's very strange that he finds himself caught up in this dynamic where he identifies himself with Parzival. And of course, what Parzival has to undergo as part of his quest for himself is a right understanding of himself in relation to God. That comes out in his lesson number 3, you might say, that he gets in how to be who he really is, the hermit that he speaks so. And Trebrizend tells him the backstory about the Grail, which is kind of a strange neo-Gnostic myth that's floating around in the background, and he tells him, and just as that is an episode which is crucial for Parzival going forward on his journey to becoming himself, so Jung himself, when he identifies with Parzival, as it were, has that similar moment which advances him on his journey to individuation in the Red Book. So that, as it were, is a kind of example of very clearly how Jung is explicitly playing with the motif of Parzival and the Grail. But the second, if I may, is just very quickly a quotation that we find in the Red Book, where Jung talks about true joy, die wahre Freude. True joy, he says, is simple because it comes and exists for itself. It is, he says, the joy which comes from fulfillment.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. Switching gears here a little bit, because that's life. And I'm just going to share here. I had mentioned this in an email. I was watching a documentary on Leonardo da Vinci, and they were reading some of his writings. Obviously, it was a voiceover. And I have heard this, I don't know, thousands of times about this Jungian, I call it a Jungian concept about not being able to have one thing without the other. I mean, 2 sides to a coin, right? And that came up a lot in analysis and obviously in reading about analytical psychology. But Da Vinci said it, and I heard that while I was reading your book, and that you can't have one thing without the other. Again, I've heard that so many times for so many years, and I got it, I get it, I understand it. No, I didn't understand it until I read your book, until I read this book. I didn't get it. I didn't really get it, that you cannot have one without the other. And that maybe my analyst said that my suffering was a good thing, because I can't have joy without suffering.
Yeah.
So, switching gears, there was another book that was released. It was released in the fall, which I mentioned in the introduction, titled Confronting Death. And it was edited by our guest in episode 90, Luis Morris, who he was training to become an analyst when we did the interview. And he is an analyst now. He's a Jungian analyst. And the consulting editor on the book is frequent guest, Jungian analyst, Dr. Murray Stein. And there are several chapters, or they're essays, that were contributed by Speaking of Jung guests. I think there are 10 or 11 Speaking of Jung guests. And one of them is the late Ann Casement, but another one is you. And I read the chapter. It's quite long. It's, I think, over 30 pages. And you open your essay by talking about, well, look, there's certain words that YouTube flags, and I don't want this episode to get demonetized or affected in the algorithm. So you were talking about the global crisis we had at the beginning of 2020 that affected the whole world. And it affected you. And you know what? I don't care if this video gets demonetized. We need to talk about it. It's important. So you opened by talking about the pandemic and COVID-19 and the effect that it had on you at the university where you were teaching and on the students. And that was another really profound insight that I felt you had, that I'm going to get out of the way and let you share with us about that essay, because again, it was realizations that I had never had before from reading your work.
Well, I was very glad to have the opportunity to work through this question of this difficult question of death. It was great that Luis got in touch and invited me to be part of it, and I felt that I had to be honest and open about the difficulty of the theme when starting the paper, and perhaps that added a little bit then into the length. And I wanted to do that because I think, the way that we thought and felt then does need to be remembered in some way. And at the moment, we're not allowed to talk about it, and it seems to me that that's not very healthy. And it's not very healthy as a matter of public policy, but it's not very healthy psychologically either. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to, on this theme of dealing honestly with difficult themes, was also then to, Goethe gets a lot of stick for not emoting enough when people in his life pass on, and I just wanted to try and take that at face value, and see how Goethe deals with trauma and with grief is, in a way, it's really up to him. I mean, how dare we say, Goethe, you're not emoting in the right way for us, so we're going to put that down as a failing on your part, as a human individual, and so I was reminded of this passage when I think it's a fantastic passage by Goethe, when he's responding to a picture by a Berlin painter, Carl Friedrich Lessing, of a monastery courtyard in the snow. And the aesthetic of this work of art, I think, is very much like, we all know the work of Caspar David Friedrich, and we think of some of the landscapes of Caspar David Friedrich with ruined abbeys and monks going through the snow. Lessing is very, very similar there. But interestingly, I think, Goethe, whilst appreciating the technical skill that goes into this painting, is skeptical about its message. And he says, and these are Goethe's words in translation, "These are sheer negations of life and the friendly habit of existence," he says. "To begin with, the dead nature, the winter landscape, I don't permit the winter. They're monks refugees from life, people buried alive. I don't permit monks. Then a monastery, and a dilapidated one. But I do not permit monasteries. And finally, just to make it complete, a dead man, a corpse, but I do not permit death. And I think that there is a power that comes out of these lines, which is not simply a negation, but as it were, it's an affirmation of a negation, that standing against death, standing against suffering, there's a kind of solidarity there in which we can all participate. That's what I wanted to argue in that paper, in this really rich collection of contributions, including one, as you've said, from Anne Casement, whom we both knew and to whom we're dedicating this episode.
Yeah. One of the lines that I pulled out from your essay is the postponement of death, as if Faust or Goethe realizes at some level that a life without death would itself be not worth living.
Yeah, that's right.
Never thought of that. Again, these things might occur to people, not me. And the way that you put them in writing. So 2 things now, this book that we've been discussing and this essay, huge themes, huge things that I think about all the time. I think about death. I think about suffering, joy, life, the Red Book.
Yeah.
And you've helped me understand them better. And this is another thing I was thinking about when I was preparing for this episode, is because I'm doing an episode every 2 weeks now, and at least that's the plan. And I need to sit with a book for a long time, and I can't just read through a book once or read through it fast and then not go back. I mean, I don't know, how long did it take you to write volume 1, the Parzival book?
That's an interesting question. It comes in some ways out of a little essay that I did for a collection of papers called Narratives of Individuation, and as it were, that's where the core of the idea came. But I sat down and seriously started to work through it during the COVID confinement, and one of the reasons for doing that was because it seemed to me, in those terrible and difficult times, why not read a great text, and why not remind yourself of what greatness is in literature. It's also because just before the spread of the COVID lockdowns, I'd actually been at a Jungian conference in Stuttgart. They very kindly invited me to go and talk about the Red Book there. And I mentioned a connection between the Red Book and Faust. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Thank you very much for your paper. By the way, what is Goethe's Faust about? I've never read it." And of course, that makes you think, well, what a difficult job it is getting non-German speakers to read Faust. But it's not a personal criticism of that person, who was quite rightly asking, "Here's something I don't know, so tell me more about it." So it's not a criticism of that person, but it is a sense that we have become disconnected from these works.
Yeah.
For various reasons that we were talking about at the beginning. And one of the things that I would like people to appreciate them is their kind of, if you like, therapeutic value. And I guess that if the work that I've been doing, and you've kindly taken the time to quote some of it and ask me about it today, but if what I'm doing nudges people back to those sources and encourages them to go and read Parsifal, Faust, and Zarathustra, and yes, to keep wrestling with the Red Book, then I think job done. And people will, I hope, enjoy rereading those texts again or discovering them for the first time. Every time you read it, you discover something new. It's a perpetual quest, a perpetual avventura.
Well, I feel that way about this book too. I will go back to it again and again. And I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us in this book. And I look forward to the other volumes and would love to have you back to discuss those as well. And hopefully by that time I get some of the recording kinks ironed out here, and it'll go a little bit more smoothly. So thank you so much for joining us today. I don't know if you had anything else that you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
Just wanted to say thank you, Laura, for inviting me to come and talk. Thank you for your interest in my work. Thank you for what you do with the podcast and the newsletter that's coming. Nothing great happens without an awful lot of effort, and I can sense that you're putting it in. And I just want to say, on behalf of other people who watch and listen to you, thank you for all the time and effort that you put into what you're doing. It's very encouraging for someone like myself who works in this field to see someone like you putting in so much effort. It's inspiring. So thank you.
Oh, I appreciate you saying that, but I wouldn't be able to do this if it weren't for the generosity of my guests and them giving so freely of their time. So I want to thank you for that, and I look forward to seeing you back soon. I don't want to rush you. Whenever the volumes are ready.
I look forward to it. So thank you so much, and you take care.
Speaking of Jung is not just a podcast, it is also a website. Please visit speakingofjung.com, where you will find extensive information on the life and work of C.G. Jung, show notes and downloads for all of our 157 episodes, a comprehensive books page, a blog, and now a monthly email newsletter, which you can sign up for at the bottom of our front page. All of our episodes are also available on YouTube podcasts, which you can access by subscribing to this channel, Jungian Laura. It's free. Just click the subscribe button below. I created Speaking of Jung almost 10 years ago. This year is our 10th anniversary, and all of our content is still free to access, but it is not free to produce. We are back to operating in the red, so please consider contributing to our tip jar on Patreon for just $5 a month, or visit our support page at speakingofjung.com/support for links on all the ways you can help keep this podcast and our website alive. With very special thanks to Dr. Stephen Buser and Jennifer Fitzgerald at Chiron Publications, I am Laura London, and you've been watching The Transformation of Speaking of Jung.